The Tolkien Road, Episode 41, Tolkien's Letters, Letter 250, Concerning Tolkien's Faith.
All right, go ahead. The Tolkien Road, 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 the Tolkien Road,
Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, a long walk through the works and philosophy of J.R.R. Tolkien. On this episode, we begin a discussion of Tolkien's letters by considering a 1963 letter he wrote to his son Michael. In this letter, Tolkien seeks to help Michael work through a period where he felt depressed. In doing so, Tolkien opens up about his own faith and how he keeps his head afloat in the world. By the way, if you haven't already, please leave the Tolkien Road a rating and feedback on iTunes. We'd love to know what you think of the podcast. Enjoy the show. All right, hey there, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Tolkien Road. This is John, joined as always by Greta.
What's up?
What's new in your world, Greta?
Not a whole lot.
Not a whole lot.
I'm just keeping it real, you know?
Cool. As usual. As usual.
You stole my words.
Mm-hmm. All right.
What's new in your world, John?
Nothing really.
Okay.
Just finishing your sentences for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's all.
Always a worthwhile enterprise.
Yes.
Yes.
So we are going to start something a little new tonight, or we're going to be talking some about Tolkien's letters.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to continue making our way through, Tolkien's different works. But I don't know. I discovered Tolkien's letters a few years ago, and I love reading his letters. I feel like that's how I loved his works before that, but when I started reading his letters, I got even further into him and kind of became a fanatic because I just found so many different things that resonated with me. And when you write, and especially I think in a time, 50 years ago when he wrote this letter, for example. It's longer than that now. About 50 years ago, writing a personal letter was a much different endeavor than writing a work that all these people were going to be reading, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like you just get to know him a little bit more, and not that he ever put up this big facade or wasn't himself in his public persona, but I don't really know that there was that big a divide between Tolkien the public persona and Tolkien the person. But in his letters we see him very, he's just very open about how he feels about things and how he looks at the world and that sort of thing.
Right, yeah.
And I just think there's tons of wisdom to be found in these works.
Yeah, I'm excited about it.
Yeah, so we are going to be reading tonight, we're going to be discussing letter 250 and the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. And let me make sure I get the book title right. It is, I'll post a link to it on our site, but it's the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by Humphrey Carpenter, and with the assistance of Christopher Tolkien. So, this is just lots of letters in this book. We are reading letter 250 in this book. Letter 250 is dated November 1st, 1963, and it's to his son Michael, who was his middle son, I believe. So he had 3 sons and then a daughter. The sons were John, Michael, and Christopher. Come to think of it, I'm not sure actually if Christopher was the middle son or if Michael was the middle son, but I know John was the oldest, and then Priscilla was the daughter. So Michael was his middle son, and I really like this letter because I feel like we learn a lot about Tolkien's own Catholic faith in this letter, and really see a lot of how he views the world through that lens and why he was Catholic in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
and also just a lot of wisdom for how to deal with both, hypocrisy in the world and also hypocrisy in the church.
Yes.
So lots of good stuff to talk about in this letter. And hopefully this is the first of many that we end up discussing.
So this is, I'm trying to remember. We haven't done a letter before, have we?
Well, the only letter we've really done is the one that's the preface to the Silmarillion.
Oh, to the editor.
Yeah, the preface.
That's right, yeah.
Which he didn't write to be the preface to the Silmarillion, but it
Right.
just happened to work out really well as one.
Right.
So we have read that one before, and I think we've maybe read some snippets from other letters.
Okay. Bless you.
Yes, bless me.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Well, before we go any further, I have to ask,
Uh-huh.
are we not doing haikus for this?
Yeah, I didn't do any haikus for this, did you?
I did. I did 3.
Oh man, making me look bad.
Well, I just assumed that, what is a Tolkien Road episode without a haiku?
Well, I kind of figured that since it's not like haiku for me is a way of it's a fun thing to do to sort of synthesize the things that I took away from the different fictional works of his, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
These I feel like he didn't write with the intention of being like works of literature. So, but that's fine. There's nothing wrong with doing that.
You're justifying your...
my laziness?
Yeah, your laziness.
Yeah, basically.
Your slothfulness. Your,
Well, let's hear him. Let's hear one.
Okay, I'll just do one.
Okay. Hit us with your best shot.
With my best shot, it's going to be tough. I feel like they're all pretty decent.
Oh, wait.
What?
What you ask?
Oh.
As if-
silly me.
as if you don't
Golly.
know.
I feel like we're out of sorts. There we go. That's going to get us back on track. Oh, I'm feeling it. Groove it. Groove it. Jumping like it's hot. Thank you, John.
You're welcome. Now let's hear
Now
haiku.
it's a real Tolkien Road
This better be good.
episode. It's not a Tolkien Road episode if you don't have haiku music in it. Anyways, okay.
Tell that to all the episodes where I recorded chapters of Tolkien's Requiem.
Oh.
Yeah.
You didn't find a way to work haiku music into that, huh?
No.
Unfortunate. Okay. Alright. Let's see. I'll just do this one. Alright, here's my haiku. Even the worst mass is cleaner than the feeding of the 5,000.
Nice.
Yeah. He said a lot of good stuff in this letter, and I think that's why I was so inspired to write 3 haikus.
Yeah.
Because I just felt like there's so many just little snippets of...
Well, good. Do you want to share another one?
Nah.
Okay.
No.
You sure?
Yeah.
Well, if you want to share, if we get to another point and you want to share another one, that's fine.
Okay, that sounds good.
So.
It could be like surprise haiku.
Yeah.
Pop-up haiku.
That's right. You could be
Where's
like
the
haiku
gonna pop
ninja.
up?
Right.
Sweet. I like
Haiku Inquisition. Nobody expects a Haiku Inquisition.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks for indulging me.
You betcha. Well, let's
Yeah.
indulge us some J.R.R. Tolkien, some John Ronald Reuel.
Yeah, let's do it.
All
Do
right.
you have any ideas? This is in 1963 that he wrote this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know... So his son must be... Obviously, he's grown. But I
Yeah.
was trying to get an idea of his age. So he mentions... In the letter, he mentions his grandson,
Yeah.
who's Michael's son, who's at university.
Right.
So you think he's like in his 40s, maybe?
By my calculation, he's 43 years old.
Oh, okay.
And I'm just going off of, Tolkien says in the second paragraph, I remember clearly enough when I was your age in 1935, which in 1935 Tolkien would have been 43, because he was born in 1892.
Nicely done. Okay.
Yeah.
Good deal.
Which actually is interesting to note, so that means Tolkien, when he's writing this letter, is almost 72. So he's getting up there.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Starting to get up there. Yeah, so it's interesting to me how I think of 43 as, not like old, but like, it's older than I am right now, and I feel like that's pretty well into adulthood. So it's really it's kind of neat to see Tolkien still, being so fatherly towards his grown son here.
Yeah, no, you're right, you're absolutely right.
In a way that he must be writing this because his son would have had to be somewhat receptive and respectful of this, of this fatherly advice to him. So it's neat they have that relationship still at this age.
At that, yes, yeah. I agree. I completely agree.
I feel like that's not as maybe not as common these days.
No, and obviously, and Tolkien is writing this letter in response to a letter that he got from Michael, right? So obviously, Michael was still comfortable sharing pretty personal, feelings and struggles with his father.
Yeah.
Which again, I don't think is very super common.
He says right up front, "I'm very sorry that you feel depressed." Well, real quick, before we get into the real substance of the letter, I really like the first paragraph. Thank you for writing. Also at length, I do not think you have inherited a dislike of letter writing from me, but the inability to write briefly, which inevitably means seldom in your life and in mine, which inevitably means seldom writing in your life and in mine. I think we both like writing letters ad familiaris, but are obliged to write so much in the way of business that time and energy fail. And I feel like that's very true of me as well. Like I feel like there's so much. I love writing, especially the things that I. And it's like this podcast. I love doing this podcast, but so many there's so many things that you do because you have to do them for work or whatever. Writing, just different jobs that it can sap you of your creative energy, to do the things that you really want to do.
That's true.
And, where he says, the inability to write briefly, it's hard. It's hard for me to sit down and be brief in what I want to say, So anyway,
you can identify.
I can identify, and and I also like the reminder when we're talking about age again that Tolkien was 43 in 1935 and had not yet published The Hobbit.
Yes.
So, he was. Yeah. That means he was 45 when The Hobbit came out.
Right.
And he was still 16 years away from 16 years away from The Lord of the Rings coming out. So, just a good reminder to all you folks out there who are trying to write the thing, the great work of your life, that Tolkien was, getting up there in age before anybody even knew who the heck he was.
Yes.
So you're never too old. Never too old to start.
Never too old to chase your dreams.
That's right.
Just keep on keeping on.
Keep on keeping on.
Climb the highest mountain, and you will reach your dream.
It's hard to hold a candle in the cold November rain.
It is.
Yeah.
But you should still climb every mountain.
Yeah.
And forge every stream.
See, we had something good going there until you had to get in there and start being all sarcastic about it.
No, I was quoting a song from The Sound of Music. You don't know that song?
No.
Climb every mountain.
Well, I guess it's just all those things you just said sound like really bad cliches now.
So you're saying that song is basically made up of really bad cliches?
No, it's probably because that how a cliche is a saying that at one point was innovative, but it's been so used that it's been cheapened.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Well, I wasn't trying to be sarcastic.
No.
I was like riffing on the cold November rain, right? I was going from what's his face? Mind blank. What's his name?
Axl Rose.
Axl Rose.
Yeah.
Guns N' Roses guy. I was going from Guns N' Roses to Sound of Music. And you didn't follow my transitions very well.
Yeah.
Probably because you've never seen a Sound of Music. Which
Tell it to the judge.
Craziness.
Wait, that's the movie with Carrie Underwood, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay.
But the good one is the one with Julie Andrews in it.
Who's Julie Andrews?
Yeah.
All
right, enough. Moving on.
That killed me.
Moving on.
So I'm very sorry that you feel depressed. So, Michael, we're not really told too many details about why, but it appears to be a response to, just kind of disenchantment with the way the world is.
It also sounds like he's sick, though, too.
Yeah.
Right?
I hope this is partly due to your ailment, but I'm afraid it is mainly an occupational affliction and also an almost universally human malady in any occupation attaching to your age. Midlife crisis, maybe,
Mm-hmm. He'd be about that age.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember clearly enough when I was your age in 1935, I had returned 10 years before to Oxford and now disliked undergraduates in all their ways and had begun really to know dons. Years before, I had rejected as disgusting cynicism by an old vulgarian the words of warning given me by old Joseph Wright. And I thought this was good. Mm-hmm. What do you take Oxford for, lad? A university, Tolkien says, a place of learning. Nay, lad, it's a factory. And what's it making? I'll tell you, it's making fees. Get that in your head and you'll begin to understand what goes on. And he says, by 1935, I now knew that it was perfectly true. And, that's so, again, I think that's something that, if you think a little bit about the way that different institutions and that sort of thing run in the world, you really do get that sense that what starts out as this endeavor to do something meaningful and help people to reach their full potential and increase knowledge in the world, and it starts out with these really altruistic motives. Mm-hmm. Inevitably, Tolkien is recognizing human institutions tend to fossilize and to just push people through, mm-hmm. And for Oxford, that's in terms of becoming a factory for fees, for generating money, mm-hmm. instead of for producing knowledge, right?
Yeah, interesting.
But what he does, Tolkien doesn't stop there with the cynical remark. He says, this is quite true, but it's not the whole truth. He says, the greater part of the truth is always hidden in regions out of the reach of cynicism. So Tolkien is almost espousing a philosophy there that says, hey, what the cynic often says is true, but it's not the whole truth. And if you just stop there, then it's almost like you're giving yourself an out. You're giving yourself a cheap excuse to quit. Tolkien's really espousing via a realist view. He's espousing a transfigured idealism, I guess you could say. That there's a greater truth that lies beyond the real, and I think this is emblematic of Tolkien's whole outlook on reality. We've talked before about the strange. Tolkien, being a fantasy writer, nevertheless has this strange obsession with reality, mm-hmm. like with making things seem real in his works. Yeah. He's not content to just tell a fairy tale that's obviously made up and has two-dimensional characters mm-hmm. and two-dimensional two-dimensional vistas and that kind of thing. Right. He is insistent on telling stories that have a depth to where you get lost in them, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And they feel as though they are real to you. So he has an obsession with reality, but it nevertheless is a reality that pushes beyond just kind of the cold, hard, brute facts into a longing for the reality to be perfected, right, and to be made whole and to be made complete, right? The sense that the reality itself is broken or not complete, and that it needs completion, right? And so when he talks about he talks about not enchantment, but I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on this. Well, it's on fairy stories where he talks about the way. So recovery. He's talking about recovery, right? Mm. Not recovery of the way things are, not the ability to see things as they are, but as they were meant to be. Right. As they were meant to be seen. Right. And I think that's emblematic of what Tolkien is all about. That he's he's not just content with one. He doesn't respond to the cynicism by saying, "Oh, well, let's just go back to the state of innocence and and just pretend like we're in this happy place. He acknowledges what's broken and this tendency of human nature and of human institutions, but pushes past it and says, what are we really longing for in the midst of this, right? What's really going on in the midst of all this? So anyway, let's keep on going. I could keep going for a while on that one point, but there's a lot more letter to go. But are you following me so far?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are not easy things to find words for. Tolkien himself had trouble finding words for some of these ideas.
Okay.
The devotion to learning, as much and without reference to one's own repute, is a high and even in a sense spiritual vocation. And since it is high, it is inevitably lowered by false brethren, by tired brethren, by the desire of money, and by pride. The folk who say my subject and do not mean the one I am humanly engaged in, but the subject I adorn or have made my own. Certainly this devotion is generally degraded and smirched in universities, but it is still there. So he honors the devotion to learning, and says that because it is a high endeavor, it is a truly high and in a sense spiritual endeavor, but because it's high, it's lowered by those who come to it false, right? And are just I'm just doing this to collect a paycheck, right? This is just where my family told me I should go to school here, and I got a degree, and now I need to make some money, right? Yep. Instead of doing it for the love of what you do and of finding out. And it's it's interesting, again, so often in life we're told to pursue the thing that's going to be a sensible income, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not denying that there is some wisdom. You don't want to just be completely, especially if you don't know what you want to do. You don't want to just start searching and not have a plan for how you're going to make ends meet for yourself.
Right.
But if you do have a sense of something that you really enjoy and that you're good at, even if it's not going to make you a wealthy man, why not go after it, right?
Sure.
Because that could be your calling, right?
Yep.
And it's so much better to be in a situation where you are happy doing what you're doing with a little, rather than having a lot and being like, I hate what I do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Money can't buy everything.
Yeah. Well, and money is only. Money does you no good if you're not happy, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's the bottom line. Money can't make you happy ultimately.
Yeah.
It can make you feel happy for a little while, but it can't make you lastingly happy.
Right.
So.
Right. So I think Tolkien is saying to not just knee-jerk, right, or deny a particular path,
right,
because it may be seen as impractical.
Right.
Yeah.
He says, so from here, he makes a transition from talking about learning into talking about religion. Really effective kind of subtle transition as a writer, and shows again what a great writer Tolkien was. But he says the far higher devotion to religion cannot possibly escape the same process. It is, of course, degraded in some degree by all professionals and by all professing Christians, and by some in different times and places outraged. And since the aim is higher, the shortcoming seems and is far worse. But you cannot maintain a tradition of learning or true science without schools and universities, and that means schoolmasters and dons. And you cannot maintain a religion without a church and ministers, and that means professionals, priests and bishops, and also monks. For myself, I find I become less cynical rather than more, remembering my own sins and follies, and realize that men's hearts are not often as bad as their acts, and very seldom as bad as their words. So again, Tolkien's, and another note of Tolkien's response here, so often we hear talk about like corruption and organized religion, and man, especially about a lot of corruption within the Catholic Church itself. Mm-hmm. And Tolkien does not deny any of that. I mean, a Catholic who knows anything about their faith will not really have their boat rocked too much by this, because it's always in our faces, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The corruption that's in the church, and the kind of the standard line is like, yeah, Jesus, the leader of the apostles that Jesus chose, denied him 3 times, right?
Yeah.
At the most crucial moment, and still Jesus chose him and forgave him, right?
And yes, Jesus knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, and so why should it bother us now, or why should it like rock our faith that there's corruption in the church,
right?
Yep. Not that it's okay necessarily. There's corruption in the church, but it shouldn't surprise us, nevertheless.
Yeah. I mean, who is the church? I mean, it's a group of imperfect humans, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But, it's sinners, right?
Yeah.
And he says, "For myself, I find I become less cynical rather than more, remembering my own sins and follies, and realize that men's hearts are not often as bad as their acts, and very seldom as bad as their words." So I really like, again, there what he does, because so often when we see corruption, we can rush to judgment against people and think like, oh, that just shows what a horrible, horrible person they truly are. Mm-hmm. But Tolkien does the reverse with it, right? It causes him to reflect on his own sins and follies when he sees these things and be like, man, like that, that the guy that just got in trouble for doing this, like, some of the things I do in my own life are sins just like those, and I don't get called out on them and held to that high standard like he does.
Right.
And he says he realizes that men's hearts are not often as bad as their acts, and very seldom as bad as their words. So, we talk a lot about frustrations with different people or just getting upset about something, and we always manage to come back to whenever it's one of us complaining about it, the other one generally will counsel the person, being like, I'm sure they didn't mean it and as badly as you took it,
Yeah, something that you've said to me on multiple occasions that I think makes a lot of sense is to not attribute motives that you don't know for sure are there, right? Don't go attributing false motives to somebody because, or any motive for that matter, because you don't know. Like, you don't know what was behind it, truly. And don't just assume the worst, right?
Yeah. Well, and the thing that should keep us honest on that is, like, would we want somebody else when we, I know I've done things to other people that I'm not proud of, and to this day still I cringe when I think about them and and how I hurt people, and I just think, like, man, I really hope that. Because and I think part of it is I cringe because I really, like, when I look at that person, I realize that I care about that person and that I probably hurt, permanently damaged my relationship with them, and so it's like, do I want them to think that I did that out of, like, complete and utter hatred and disdain for them? Like, right. No, I didn't.
No.
Maybe I was in a bad moment or frustrated or whatever, and I said unkind things. Because I was just in a really bad place, and they were the ones there that were easiest to take my frustrations out on,
Right.
But so often our frustrations, when we maybe lash out at somebody else or say an unkind thing to someone else, it's a frustration with our situation and not so much with that person. The person is just the stand-in for the overall
scapegoat,
the overall situation. Yeah, great word. I mean, he actually uses that a little further on, the scapegoat thing, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, I just found that really valuable. I've become less cynical rather than more, remembering my own sins and follies, and realize that men's hearts are not often as bad as their acts, and very seldom as bad as their words.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That line.
So. Next paragraph, and if I skip over anything you want to cover, feel free to hit it, okay? He says, "You speak of sagging faith, however. That is quite another matter. In the last resort, faith is an act of will inspired by love." And I think so often we don't think of faith as an act of the will, but as a feeling, right? Oh, I just feel like this is true, But that's, especially in a Catholic understanding, that's not what faith is. Like, faith is, there is the belief component of faith, but generally speaking, faith is much more robust than that. Especially when Catholics refer to faith, there's the old red, kind of not red herring, but just thing that always gets thrown in Catholics' faces of being all about faith and works and salvation by works and that kind of thing. But for the Catholic, it's like faith and works are two sides of the same coin, right?
Absolutely. I mean, St. James says, right?
Yeah.
Faith without works is dead.
They're the same. They're the.
It's the fruit.
Well, it's not just that it's the fruit. It is the fruit. You're right, but it's not just that. It's like, it's the living relationship with God, right? It's the, it's God's life within you.
Yes.
Right, and faith is the clinging to God, right? Mm-hmm. But faith works. Faith has to work, or it's dead, right? It's not really faith. That's kind of the point of what James says,
Right.
It's just kind of assent of the mind, but it doesn't cost you anything, right? Mm-hmm. But he says faith is an act of the will. Faith is exhausting, right? Because it requires the act of the will. A little bit later in the letter, he says, the act of will of faith is not a single moment of final decision. It is a permanent, indefinitely repeated act, a state which must go on. So we pray for final perseverance. That in the traditions, the kind of traditions that we were brought up in, non-Catholic traditions, faith was very much kind of like, it was the moment I believed and I decided that I was a believer now, or I asked Jesus into my heart and became a believer. And that's kind of like, that's the moment of faith. And the rest of your life is a life of faith, but you don't really, I never thought of it in those terms, at least. I never thought of it as being a will, like an act of the will to continually believe. Whenever I would struggle with belief, I would be like, why am I struggling? And now as a Catholic, I'm like, it's normal to struggle. Like, it's not a bad thing for you to struggle in your faith.
Right.
It's part of becoming stronger in faith, actually.
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. That was actually my one of my other haikus, was just that sentence right there.
Let's hear it.
Well, it was just perfect. It was actually almost a perfect haiku. Just that sentence. In the last resort, faith is an act of, I added the word true. Faith is an act of true will, inspired by love.
Nice.
Yeah.
Inspired by love, absolutely.
And that's also very, that's just that idea too, just is very reminiscent of Saint Therese of Lisieux, right? Who says that we cannot do really any great works, but small works, small things with great love.
Is that Therese of Lisieux or Mother Teresa?
Maybe it's Mother Teresa.
I think it's Mother Teresa.
You're right, it is Mother Teresa. But Therese of Lisieux also talks about the little way. Well, she talks about the little way, too, where we do, you're right, that is Mother Teresa. The little acts with great love. Because anything inspired by love is automatically going to make it stronger and better, just because of the fact that it was inspired by love. Right? Because love is, it makes, it just makes everything more valuable when it's a part of it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's, you think about faith and, the other kind of, another common way of speaking about faith is in terms of marriage. And it's like if a husband and wife, if their faithfulness to one another amounted to like having loving thoughts for one another in their heads all the time, and that was what faithfulness to their spouse meant, that's not a very solid marriage,
that's
right?
Not a solid marriage, no.
And that
you need to have the actions to back it up.
Exactly, yeah. You need to have the works that go with it, right? To show that it's a living faith and it is actually faith. But again, it's like, I don't know. I don't even feel like it's right to oppose like faith and works as two different things in a sense. Like to me, again, they're two sides of the same coin. One without the other doesn't really make sense.
No, it really doesn't. It doesn't. But that is kind of a novel idea, I think, to think of faith as an action,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, to think of it as something that we actively need to do.
Right.
That we actually have to work at.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about what do you think of when you think of the word scandal?
Scandal?
Yeah.
I think of deception.
Mm-hmm.
And, kind of like an event that, that people might be embarrassed for others to find out about.
Okay.
Something that would hurt a reputation.
Like, yeah, it's winding up on the cover of National Enquirer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes.
I was about to say winding up on the cover of National Geographic.
What a scandal. What? Yes.
Yeah, that'd be strange.
Yeah, it would be strange.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But scandal. I think scandal. The idea we have of scandal now is not exactly what he's talking about here. Scandal is more like being scandalized by something, like, and I think the best way of putting it is like something that causes you to stumble in your faith, right?
Like a
or
temptation.
or even like seeing the example of someone else that you think to be, this upstanding person, and then all of a sudden you see them fall, right? And it really scandalizes you, because you had great respect
almost
for them
like
before.
like a traumatization kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so he says scandal at most is an occasion of temptation. So he's speaking about this just in terms of the bad example of various clergy that he supposed was making Michael stumble in his own faith. And he says scandal at most is an occasion of temptation, as indecency is to lust, which it does not make but arouses. It is convenient because it tends to turn our eyes away from ourselves and our own faults to find a scapegoat. And so again, you go back to this idea of like, it's easy to look at other people's sins and let that be the reason that you choose to not have faith, but he puts, he always turns this back and says like, just because you see other people stumbling along this way and failing, that's not an excuse for you to fail, right? Who is your faith really in? Is it in these people, or is it in Jesus Christ, right? And that's where he gets into this, the idea that I think I am as sensitive to you as to the scandal as you to the scandals both of clergy and laity. I have suffered grievously in my life from stupid, tired, dimmed, and even bad priests, but I now know enough about myself to be aware that I should not leave the church, which for me would mean leaving the allegiance of our Lord for any such reasons, right? So he basically says, if I were to leave the faith because of the scandals of others, it would be amounting to leaving the Lord, and it would be basically saying like, I don't have faith in you anymore, to the Lord, and so his point is that don't let you worry about your faith, right? You don't worry about the failures in other people's faith and other people's example. You worry about your faith, and you put your faith in Christ, right?
Yep.
You place it there, which again is great advice.
Absolutely. 'Cause,
Go ahead.
Really, not that we shouldn't, respect and look up to priests and bishops and things like that, but we still need to recognize that they are fallible human beings,
Right?
like we are, and we can't let our faith ride on their actions or inactions, right?
Yeah.
We need to put our faith in the one perfect person who founded the church, right? And not be so affected by, the failings of an imperfect leader.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amen. Amen. Preach it, sister.
Preach it.
All right, let's pause, take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back. Let's take a quick commercial break so we can gather in some filthy mammon.
What?
Filthy lucre. Mammon. Lucre. Money.
Oh, is that what that is? Oh, bad joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, maybe I'll edit that one out too.
Maybe
Sorry.
you should.
I guess
have to edit out like half this episode by the time we're done. Jeez.
I'll burp really loud right now. All right. We'll be right back.
Don't go away. Hey, Tolkien Roadsters. What's shaking? Greta Carswell here, just getting my groove on to the Tolkien Haiku theme music. Man, that's an awesome song. You know what else is awesome? Feedback on the Tolkien Road on iTunes. Oh yeah, you heard me right. iTunes feedback is one of the best ways you can tell the world about your undying love for this podcast. Because it lets those knuckleheads at Apple know that the Tolkien Road is where it's at. I mean, come on. Why didn't they know that already? Am I right? So next time you're waiting in line to pick up some delicious tacos, surfing the World Wide Web, brushing up on a Tom Bombadil factoid, or keeping it real in whatever way you keep it real, pop on over to iTunes and let the human race know what you think about the Tolkien Road. We're all dying to know, for reals. Party on, y'all.
Okay, picking up where we left off. If he is a fraud and the gospel's fraudulent, speaking of Jesus, if Jesus is a fraud and the gospel's fraudulent, that is, garbled accounts of a demented megalomaniac, then of course the spectacle exhibited by the church is in history and today is simply evidence of a gigantic fraud. If not, however, then this spectacle is, alas, only what was to be expected. It began before the first Easter, and it does not affect faith at all, except that we may and should be deeply grieved. But we should grieve on our Lord's behalf and for him, associating ourselves with the scandalizers and not with the saints. See, that's the other, great passage there, and Tolkien riffs on this idea that Lewis forwarded of, if Christ is either a fraud or a madman or he is who he says he is. He's not just a good teacher, right?
Right.
He's riffing on this idea, and he says, if Christ is a fraud, then the church is a fraud. But if he's not, then the spectacle of scandal of clergy and laity and Christians misbehaving is only what was to be expected. It began before the first Easter with Peter and with Judas as well, and it does not affect faith at all, except that we may and should be deeply grieved. And this is really good, but we should grieve on our Lord's behalf and for him, associating ourselves with the scandalizers and not with the saints. I feel like so often when we see other people fail, we tend to, it's like a way of bolstering our own self-righteousness and our own sense of like how good of people we are, instead of saying to ourselves like, I'm a sinner, I'm with him, I'm with the one that fell, and not with the saints in this. And I think that's what Tolkien is going after here. Not crying out that we cannot take Judas Iscariot or even the absurd and cowardly Simon Peter or the silly women like James's mother trying to push her sons. So I think that's just a really good takeaway to remember whenever we see something, whether it's other Christians or just human beings in general. Whenever we see people doing wrong things, and this, none of this is to deny that people do wrong things, but we want to be quicker to associate ourselves with the people who do wrong things in the sense of being like, I'm more like that person than I am like the saint,
Yep.
I'm not this perfect person, so I shouldn't be putting myself in judgment over anybody else, right?
Exactly. Before you point out the speck in your brother's eyes, right?
Exactly.
Pull out the plank in your own eye.
The plank
first.
in your own eye. That's right.
Yep.
Okay, he talks about how there's some people even today that forward this idea that Jesus didn't really exist, which Tolkien, again, and along with most people that I've ever read, say that idea is absurd. And he basically says it takes a fantastic will to unbelief to suppose that Jesus never really happened, right?
Yes.
And again, he invokes this notion of will to unbelief, right? And again, I think that we probably don't have enough time to go into it right now, but I think there's a lot to this notion of willing oneself to believe things. And especially when it's hard, when things aren't right there in front of your face. willing ourselves, that we all have to exert will and exert energy, mental energy, whatever it may be, to continue on a certain road, a certain path of belief.
Right.
About the way reality is.
Yeah, we actually have to work at it.
Mm-hmm.
We have to make a conscious decision.
But the same thing can sometimes apply to the will to unbelief. There's a, I think there can be a, I can see the rationale behind a mild agnosticism, which says, I don't know, and it's just more of like a searcher kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Trying to figure it out. I have a much harder time with sympathizing with, and it's not to be an insult against anyone out there, but I have a much harder time empathizing with this like hardened atheism that's dogmatically certain that there is no God.
Yes. And I can prove it.
Yeah,
yeah.
It just doesn't. It doesn't make sense to me. Now I can actually see a little bit where the the anti-theists come in, the ones who are almost like, they're not just atheists, they're like out to get God, almost in the sense of like the idea of God. But there is a will to believe something when it comes to being an atheist, right? As opposed to being an agnostic who says, I'm not sure and I'm searching, right? Yeah. Because to set oneself up as a hardened atheist just seems to be, it almost seems to be setting oneself up as God and omniscient, right? To know that there's not a God, right?
Yeah,
to be able to say, like, I know for certain there's not a God. Mm-hmm. Now, different people have different definitions of what atheism means and that sort of thing, but I'm just talking about that particular view and trying to sympathize with Tolkien's notion of this will to unbelief. A little later he says, I find it for myself difficult to believe that anyone who has ever been to communion, even once, with at least right intentions, can ever again reject him without grave blame. However, he alone knows each unique soul and its circumstances. And he goes on to say, the only cure for sagging the sagging of fainting faith is communion. So what do you make of that? Why do you think that he recommends communion as the cure for sagging faith?
Well, I mean, it is the sacrament, right? That as Catholics we believe that you receive the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. And receive him in a very real and special way, right? You actually receive him and he becomes a part of you, right? And so, when you make a good, if you're in a state of grace, when you receive communion, then Jesus is actually, he's inside you and he literally becomes a part of your body.
Yeah.
And how can you get much closer to Jesus than that in a literal sense? No.
Yeah.
Can't. So, I think that's maybe one reason, but I'm sure there's others. What do you think?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, part of Catholicism is this notion that even though belief, like kind of the intellectual belief is a big part of it, and intellectual knowledge is a big part of it, the sacramental element of Catholicism is this notion that the sacraments operate on us in ways that we don't really even understand. Yep. Right? Mm-hmm. There's this very surface level understanding of it, but the sacraments are these ways that kind of get under our skin and just into the very depths of our being, and transform us from the inside out. And so, we might go through all this effort to be better people, but receiving communion is basically saying to God, like, you do your work on me, right? Not me doing my work on myself, but you do your work on me.
Yes.
From the inside out.
Yep.
It's basically this act of surrender and saying, come inside of who I am and fix me.
Yes.
From the inside out.
Yep.
7 times a week is more nourishing than 7 times at intervals. And then we come to this great line, which I've tried to quote ad nauseum, but I can never quite get it right. I can recommend this as an exercise. Make your communion in circumstances that affront your taste. Choosing a snuffling. So, there's a lot of, let's just be honest, in the Catholic Church today, there's a lot of liturgy that's not reverently performed, or even if it is reverently performed, it's kind of cheesy and corny and seemingly unworthy of
Doesn't
what
remind
we're
you much of
experiencing.
heaven.
Exactly.
Yes.
And it's very frustrating sometimes, because you're like, this should be beautiful and glorious. This is we're entering into heaven,
right,
is what we believe. So why is this come off as less than that?
Right. Right.
But Tolkien remarkably says, make your communion in circumstances that affront your taste. I mean, why would he go so far as to do that, do you think?
Well, doesn't he kind of explain it when he goes on? I mean, I think, this is, where I got my haiku, right? Where he says, even, the worst of the worst, right? It's still going to be better than the feeding of the 5,000, right? I mean, that was just like chaos defined. And granted, that was not, it was after this feeding. This happened obviously before the Last Supper, where Jesus instituted the Eucharist. But obviously, this, the feeding of the 5,000 was a foreshadowing,
right,
of the Eucharist. But anyway, I think because it gives us more to offer up, right? Mm-hmm. It unites us in a very small way with Christ's suffering. Mm-hmm. And, not that I'm trying to compare a mass filled with bad music and screaming children to Jesus, being nailed to the cross. But in our lives and in that moment, it is a way that we're suffering, right?
Yeah.
The music is affronting our, it's an affront to our ears, right? Or, the child screaming in the back is threatening to distract us from the homily or whatever. Yeah. It's a little way of suffering, and it's something that we can use to, we can offer that to God, and in just a tiny way come to understand Him and what He went through for our salvation a little bit more. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good explanation, and it's all about becoming more Christ-like, right? Because the ultimate example of this spirit of humiliation, of self-humiliation, is Christ, who is God, who created everything, owns everything, is above everything, becoming one of us, and not just becoming a human being, but becoming a poor human being and becoming a weak and helpless human being in the form of a child, and dying a weak criminal death, right? Yeah. Willingly. Yes. Right? It's that surrender of my will in order to have it transformed into the will that God wants. Yes. Which is the ever-present, constant battle of the Christian life. To surrender one's will to God so that He can transform it into the will that He wants. Yes. The will that He intends for us to have.
Not my will, but yours.
Right? Yeah, so to go to a communion where the circumstances affront your taste heightens the will that you have to exert in making it a good mass, right? You have to work on your part. Yeah. Rather than it's like, where you go to like some high mass in a beautiful church and, everything, it's just chant and, organ, and it's all beautiful and glorious, and you're just like floating along on cloud nine. You go to, the suburban church, during the school week where the kids are going to chapel once a week because they have to, and they're being noisy and disrespectful, and the priest is forgetting the words, and you're just like, everything is an affront to you. Mm-hmm. But you have to. That means that you have to make that constant effort to be like, it's not about me.
Right.
It's about Christ, and it's about the Mass.
Yeah.
And as long as he's there, and as long as the priest gets, consecrates that bread and wine, he's there, right?
Right. Yep.
So great advice. Make your communion in circumstances that affront your taste.
And that kind of harkens back to the little piece of advice he gave earlier, right? To not associate, we should not be associating ourselves with the saints, right? But the scandalizers. In a way, it puts us in our place. Exactly,
and it helps, for those of us who are inclined to get religiously hoity-toity, to remember that, like, you know what? In God's eyes, I'm no different. I'm just the same as any of these people. In fact, there's probably some people here that I don't realize are a whole lot more special in God's eyes than I am.
Yep. Yep.
Probably a lot more special because I tend to think of myself too much.
Exactly.
I mean, it's just this constant humbling. Need to humble oneself.
Yeah, and you think about where the first Eucharist happened, right? I mean, it was like a hush hush thing, in some guy's house, right? And there were not. There weren't stained glass windows, and there weren't icons everywhere, and it was not. There was really nothing special about it except for the fact that Jesus was there,
right?
Right, and he instituted the Eucharist. That was it. But that's enough. That's all you need. Mm-hmm. That in and of itself is more than enough.
That's right. Okay, so he says, I myself am convinced by the Petrine claims, nor looking around the world, does there seem much doubt which, if Christianity is true, is the true church. So Tolkien is basically saying that he is a convinced Catholic.
Is that Petrine claims? Is that talking about Peter?
Yeah, the claims of Peter, basically that Peter was. Obviously that on this rock I will build my church is in Scripture. So if you're a Christian, is in the Gospel. So if you're a Christian, those words are you have those words, but the Petrine claims is more saying that Peter had a truly unique office, and that office carried on after his death. Right.
Gotcha.
So he says of himself that he is a convinced Catholic. For me, the church of which the Pope is the acknowledged head on earth has a chief claim that it is the one that has, and still does, ever defend the Blessed Sacrament, and given it most honor, and put it, as Christ plainly intended in the prime place. So it's all very united to the Blessed Sacrament for Tolkien. He sees in the Catholic Church that the Catholic Church has held up the Eucharist, far more than all other churches out there. With all I will say with all due respect to our Orthodox brothers and sisters, who maybe Tolkien didn't so much have in mind when he was writing this, because he's from England after all, and thinking more in terms of a Catholic versus Protestant paradigm.
Sure. Yep.
But he holds up the Blessed Sacrament as kind of the center of it all, which is very in keeping with the Catholic faith. Feed my sheep was his last charge to St. Peter, and since his words are always first to be understood literally, I suppose them to refer primarily to the bread of life. It was against this that the Western European revolt, or Reformation, was really launched. The blasphemous fable of the Mass. And he's using quotation marks there. And faith works, a mere red herring. Okay, he did call faith and works a mere red herring. But he's basically saying faith and works was a distraction, that it was something that it was a shiny object and controversial point that took people's attention away from while the sacraments were destroyed in different ways. And so you can see that Tolkien is not merely a convinced Catholic, but he's got a little bit of a bone to pick too with the history of the Reformation.
Yes.
Despite his friendship with many people who were not Catholic, he he still has strong feelings and is very much kind of, all about being on Team Catholic.
Yes.
I guess you could say. So,
absolutely.
Yeah. So the great reform of our time that was carried out by St. Pius X. Do you know what that refers to? Did you understand that?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, he was talking about communion, right? He was talking about
children.
Did
you look at the footnote?
Yeah, I did.
Go ahead and read the footnote if you got it.
Yeah, it was about it had to do with daily receipt of communion.
Yeah.
Possibly a reference to Pius X's recommendation of daily communion and children's communion.
Yeah. Yeah, Pius X, like before the time of Pius X, which was the late 19th century, I believe, it was Catholics, the average Catholic was not encouraged to receive communion very often, right? And Pius X kind of turned that around. And
do you know when that was? What year?
I don't know off the top of my head.
I'll Google it real quick, because I'm curious.
Yeah. And then when he refers to the council, he's referring to Vatican II,
right,
which was going on at this time.
Right.
And so while you're looking it up, he goes on and says, this is rather an alarming and rambling disquisition to write. It is not meant to be a sermon. I have no doubt that you know as much and more. I am an ignorant man, but also a lonely one. I love that note too, because he's basically saying, I almost get the sense that Michael wasn't asking for this like long discourse on religion, but
but how often do I ask you a question, or one of the kids asks me a question, and you end up 15 minutes later, still in the process of giving them a lecture about this and that or whatever, right? And it happens.
Yeah,
you find that you have more to say on a certain topic.
Yeah, and I also think Tolkien used to have his buddies, the Inklings, that he would hang out with, when he was younger, and they would talk about stuff like this and about literary works and all those kinds of things. And it sounds like he's hungry for that. He doesn't really have that anymore.
No, he's lonely.
So he looks for
He's
opportunities.
lonely. Mm-hmm.
Really interesting note on this. So on this letter, it was written just a couple of weeks before the death of C.S. Lewis. So, and I don't think he and Lewis saw very much of each other anymore at this point. I think they were still friends, but they had kind of didn't cross paths as much anymore. But it is interesting to note that it was just a few weeks before C.S. Lewis passed away.
Yeah.
That he wrote this. So
exactly 3.
Yeah.
It would be exactly 3 weeks. Yeah.
So he is a he says I'm a lonely man. So I had an opportunity to write a long letter, and I chose to write it, and these are the things that were on my heart and I wanted to express. But he also says, and I love this, I live in anxiety concerning my children.
Yeah. And
you can hear in his voice that he has a lot of regrets about how he was as a father, and he knows that at different times he was not the most faithful in following the Catholic faith, and regrets it now especially because of his children and the example he may have failed to give his children, or bad example he gave his children at different times.
Yep.
Let's see. Where does he say it?
About the kids?
Out of wickedness and sloth, I almost ceased to practice my religion, especially at Leeds and at 22 Northmoor Road. But he also talks about, he's had this love of the Blessed Sacrament from the very beginning, the astonishing charity of Father Francis Morgan, who was the priest that raised him for the latter half of his childhood,
right,
after his mother passed away.
How old was Tolkien when his mom died? Was he
early teens, I think?
Okay.
Yeah.
So he was young.
Yeah, he was.
He was an only child?
No, he had a brother. He had a brother too.
Oh, okay.
His father died when he was very young, and then his mother died several years after that. But he was still a child.
This Francis Morgan, he took in both. Both him and his brother.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And then.
This was a father, right? This was a priest.
Yeah, this is a priest. Yeah. Not to me the hound of heaven, but the never-ceasing silent appeal of tabernacle and the sense of starving hunger. So Nice
Can
Francis.
we back up
Yeah.
real quick? Did you mention this already about his mom and her role in his faith?
No, go
I
ahead.
found that very touching.
Go ahead.
Where he says that, he said, but I fell in love with the Blessed Sacrament from the beginning, and by the mercy of God, never fallen out again. But alas, I indeed not live up to it. It was before that, where he says, my mother who brought me into the church.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously he credits his mother with his faith.
Yeah, the heroic sufferings and
Yes.
early death and extreme poverty of my mother who brought me into the church.
Yeah.
And received the astonishing charity of Francis Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. He considered his mother a martyr in a way,
Yes.
because she was an adult convert and put up with a lot of grief from her family over that matter.
Even to the point where they basically cut her off, right? Like they wouldn't help support her or the kids.
Think so, yeah. But I mean, there's definitely some stuff like that was going on. Without getting too specific on it, because I don't have the biography right in front of me where it can tell me that. But I know I've read some things like that. So there was definitely a lot of animosity towards her. I think she may have come from a Baptist background.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so not for me the hound of heaven, but the never-ceasing silent appeal of tabernacle and the sense of starving hunger.
So is he referring to Francis Thompson's
He
poem?
must be. I think that's a Francis Thompson reference. But it's interesting, he says, not for me the hound of
not
heaven,
for me,
but just the constant appeal of the tabernacle.
So
being
is he
there.
saying that he didn't so much need that chasing out? Because in the Hound of Heaven, Christ is portrayed as a...
Yeah. Well, if you think of Francis Thompson as like the opium addict and the guy who was like running away from God and,
I see.
was like a beggar on the streets.
I see. Okay.
I think Tolkien is saying, like, I didn't lead this, like, super scandalous life.
I didn't need to be chased down. Is that what he's saying?
Well, he's not saying that so much. I think he's saying that I wasn't living this super scandalous life. It was more that I just was kind of living mediocrity.
Like kind of lukewarm.
Yeah, exactly. But the presence of the tabernacle was always there for me, bidding me come. And a sense of starving hunger. I regret those days bitterly and suffer for them with such patience as I can be given, most of all because I failed as a father. Now I pray for you all unceasingly, that the healer shall heal my defects, and that none of you shall ever cease to cry, Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini. Which, do you know what that means?
Mm-hmm.
What?
Blessed are those who come in the name of the Lord.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. All right.
It's interesting that he feels like a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder why that is. I wonder if it's because he feels like he was so busy with, creating. They didn't take the time to impart his faith to his children, or does he just feel like he didn't live it out, like he wasn't the model?
I mean, I don't know that anybody. I don't know that you could be a good father if you didn't at times feel like a failure as a father.
That's probably true.
I'm sure the same thing goes for motherhood, right? Like, if the moment you think, man, I'm an awesome father, like, you're probably really not. And, I try to do a good job being a father, but like, there's always days where I'm like, man, I totally did not put my kids first today, just in the way that or not even first, but I could have spent a little, even 5 minutes of quality time just talking to them and asking them how their day was, and really like just taking a moment to bond with them and actually treat them as though they really matter to me. And did I do that today? That's something I ask myself almost every day. And I don't know exactly what Tolkien was feeling. I think he felt some regret over setting a bad example in terms of the faith.
Okay.
In terms of living his faith. And I think that's chiefly what he's referring to. Yeah. But, his oldest son did become a priest, so...
Hey, he did something right.
Yeah, one of them seemed to go okay. Maybe not Michael so much. Anyway. Well, I don't know, any other stuff you want to cover in this letter? I mean, there's the rest of it is just kind of some afterthoughts, and they talk. I guess Michael George is his grandson. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about him and about his aptitude for language, and complains about taxes and stuff like that. Yeah. None of it very interesting to me, but
I think we definitely already hit the
high points.
Yeah, the high points, the really good stuff.
All right.
No, I think it's a great letter.
Yeah.
It's absolutely beautiful. I think obviously he shows a lot of wisdom, and I feel like this would be a good thing to revisit whenever you're feeling down or discouraged or feeling kind of lackluster in your faith. It would be a good thing to read the next time you tend to get annoyed by all the distractions at Mass. Just remember Tolkien's words.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I took away anything from this, it's that even the simple Christian life, the Christian life is meant to be hard. Like, it's not meant to be a walk in the park.
You look at Jesus' life, right?
Yeah, it's...
he was born to die, so it doesn't get much rougher than that.
Right. But born to die that he might reveal a new life to us, right?
Yes, well,
a new
absolutely.
and transformed and transfigured life to us. Mm-hmm. But you have to pass through that first.
Yes.
And the Christian faith is a constant act of the will, right? Mm-hmm. It's a constant decision to go the way of Christ rather than the way of sin and of death and of the world, Yeah,
it's so countercultural.
Yeah.
It's really countercultural, and it takes courage, and it takes a, like you said, it's that act of faith. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you how many times I'll say, God, I believe, help my unbelief.
Right.
It's hard. I mean, with our fallible, short-sighted human eyes, it's hard to really see what we're meant to see.
Exactly.
But if we ask for the help, He'll give it to us.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty.
That was good stuff. Yeah, it was really good. I enjoyed that.
All right. Oh, we got a cat yelling at us. All right.
Yeah, she wants her warm, overstuffed chair back.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for listening. Next episode, we will return to the Silmarillion with Chapter 11.
Yep.
And I think we'll be continuing down the road of talking about letters too, some more. So if you got one you'd really love to hear us talk about, let us know.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's plenty in here, so we can always come up with a few ourselves. So.
Yep. This is true.
All right.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Greta. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys for listening.
Party on.
Party on. And bye.
Bye-bye. Please remember to check out truemyths.org for show notes and plenty of other Tolkien goodness. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, would you please leave the Tolkien Road a rating and feedback on iTunes? It's a great way to support the show and takes less than a minute. On the next episode, we continue our discussion of the Silmarillion with Chapter 11, of the Sun and Moon and the Hiding of Valinor. Please tune in, and until next time, the road goes ever on.